Hello, I'm Jane Dysart, and I'm a consultant and partner with Dysart and Jones Associates, and I'm also the program chair for KMWorld and have been since 2000. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about the KMWorld conference and look at some of the key ideas and concepts that have persisted over the decades within our conference. I'm going to give you a little bit about background for KMWorld. I'm going to talk about those themes. I'm going to give you some resources and some links to further information. And then I hope we have some questions and comments and discussion at the end. So here we go. A little bit of background. Information Today is a publisher and conference producer, and they purchased KMWorld in 2000 from a company who said they wanted KMWorld to examine knowledge management as the balance of content, people, and processes, and of course, with convergent technologies. And the first few conferences that Information Today produced were in Silicon Valley in California. In fact, the very first one in 2001 was in Santa Clara, and it was described as the world's largest and most comprehensive conference and exhibition dedicated to content, work, collaboration, knowledge, intellectual asset management, and business competitive intelligence. Basically, the themes for that year were around knowledge networks, the tools and technologies, KM strategies, the processes and models, the culture and collaborative issues, the assets themselves, the information, the content, the knowledge, as well as my favorite part, the case studies and the lessons learned by organizations who were involved with knowledge sharing activities. And that's what I call it, knowledge sharing activities. KM, knowledge management, really to me doesn't mean a lot because I don't believe you can manage knowledge. So I use KM as a shortcut for knowledge sharing activities. So when I say KM, think knowledge sharing activities. Okay, a little bit more background. In 2010, KMWorld moved to the East Coast to Washington, D.C. It was decided that there were more organizations, governments on the East Coast that were involved with KM at the time, and that Information Today wanted to reach. In addition, at that point in time, the technology industry was having a tough time. And so Silicon Valley wasn't the best venue for the conference. But the conference really has always been about knowledge sharing, enabling organizations to find, reuse, collaborate, innovate, basically knowledge sharing for action and success of the enterprise, of the organization. And so therefore it did involve teams. And that's always a challenge too. That's where the cultural side comes in. And of course, the technologies, the tools, the processes, which underlie and support those knowledge sharing activities. I wanted to say that you don't always find KM or knowledge sharing activities described that way on an organization chart. In fact, you may not see anything that looks like what you would think of as KM. Those activities could be within a learning department, within communications, IT, strategy, the office of the CIO, maybe maybe there's a CKO, a chief knowledge officer, but those are few and far between. The second link here is to a list that was put together by KMers, the knowledge management, what's in the name. And it was sort of a group thing of what knowledge sharing activities could be called in an organization. And there were over 240 activities that people thought of as KM activities or knowledge sharing activities. So there are lots of different names, but the activities are pretty, you see them throughout organizations, even if they aren't called KM. Now, at this point, I have a little bolt on my slide that says KM is dead. And I have to say, for years and years, I kept hearing this, and people wanted to have discussions about, is KM dead? And yes, it has had quieter periods and louder periods within organizations over the last 20 years. And I think people, kept saying they thought it was dead because it might be called something different. And that's why I wanted to mention the different names for knowledge sharing activities. But knowledge sharing is always going to be critical within organizations. It's always going to be important that you find and reuse the knowledge that you have created so that you can build upon that. You can collaborate with others. You can help them learn their skills and learn how to create new, innovate within their organizations. So moving on to the actual core of KM. And this is my personal opinion. So this is Jane's KM. This is the core. Is KM, an involving discipline? Does it have a core? I believe it does have a core. And that core is always the people, the culture, how organizations operate, the teams, how do they go together? How do people share? How do they learn within an organization? Then there's the big finding piece. And this is always the part that comes up with KM activities. How do we find the appropriate people, the experts, whether they're internal or external? How do we find the content, the repositories? Where are they hiding within our organization? How do we find people who are involved in the same kind of activities that we are, that we can learn from, those communities? How do we find those people within our organization? And then there's the whole organizing and curating side, whether it's information architecture, the standard vocabularies, that's where the taxonomies come in. How do we refer to things in the same way so that we can find those? How can we organize things so that we can get at them in the future? How do we maintain our knowledge base, our assets, our intellectual assets within the organization? So the finding and curating are really important. And then there's the whole action, the actual learning, the decision-making with the information and the data and the content and the knowledge, and the taking action to actually create and innovate and go beyond what has been within the organization. How does it continue to grow and develop and distinguish itself from other organizations? I put together a list of conference themes for the last 10, 12 years. And it was interesting to me to see them all together here because I've created them, but it's interesting to see how there are themes. And definitely, as you would expect, the key words that you see throughout those themes conference themes are knowledge and sharing, because the knowledge sharing, as I say, is at the core. But you also see lots about people, about collaboration, about technology and tools. So those are a lot of the keys with the conference themes. This year's conference, 2022, is being held next month in Washington, D.C. And the theme there is people driving knowledge sharing. It's the people behind the knowledge sharing that are going to create that innovation, the resilience to deal with what's happened over the last few years, and being agile to be able to turn, to do different things, to make sure that organizations thrive and grow. Again, the conference focuses a lot around technology, and search has, as I mentioned, has always been a really important one. I can remember years ago when we were talking a lot about natural language processing, and it was difficult to do in the early 2000s. And yet today, with artificial intelligence, it's a heck of a lot easier. And text analytics, analyzing text, has now, risen to a much higher level. And those two areas are areas that we have a particular focus on at KMWorld, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. Organization of the content has always been, as I had mentioned before too, important. And Microsoft has often been with us. In the early years, there were many, many technologies trying to find their way in KM. But Microsoft really evolved with SharePoint a number of years ago, with people putting their technology to work in the KM area. And now they have evolved into a whole new suite of technologies that are using AI and really sophisticated algorithms to help organizations. So we're looking forward to a lot more about that at the conference next month. Sharing and collaboration, as I say, the knowledge sharing has always been important, but it has changed substantially. When we started this conference under the wing of Information Today in 2001, the internet was just sort of beginning. Can you believe that? That's so long ago. We were barely talking about intranets, and then we went into wikis and Facebook styled platforms within organizations, internal to organizations, things like Slack. But I'm really looking forward to seeing what organizations have done over the last few years in putting new technologies in place to help people connect during the more work remotely. A lot of global organizations have been doing that for years, but many have not, and many have had to step up. So it will be really interesting to see what technologies people are using now and focusing on to help that sharing and collaboration. KMWorld is a platform for many different conference activities, including the focus on search. Enterprise search and discovery has its own track and theme, as does Taxonomy Bootcamp. And there I want to tell you a story about when we were still on the West Coast. We did a workshop around technologies. And whereas most of our half-day in-depth workshops had, 15, 20 people, the taxonomy one had 70 people. And we thought, wow, this is really interesting. So that's when Taxonomy Bootcamp was born. And as part of KMWorld, it brings in probably about 200 people that are really focused on taxonomy And many of those are experts. Some of them are just trying to learn. But it's very interesting to see that dedicated group as part of the KMWorld umbrella. Text analytics is a newer part, focus of the conference. Tom Reamy wrote the book about text analytics, and he's the conference chair of that particular part of the conference. So KMWorld is the umbrella of the event, but it does have, as I say, enterprise search and discovery, taxonomy bootcamp, text analytics, and people can register just for those events, or they can register for the whole KMWorld event, which includes the enterprise and the taxonomies. And it's often organizations will bring a whole team. A few years ago, we had a team of 7 people from one organization in the Midwest of the US, and the KM leader thought that their tech group that came with them would really be focused on the technologies, but they didn't. They followed the KM part, and the whole group had fantastic discussions following the conference. So often we see teams of people at KMWorld from different organizations. So I've left you the links to the conference with its program, its speakers, its schedule, as well as those for Taxonomy Bootcamp, Enterprise Search and Development, and Text Analytics Forum. So you can find more information and see what we're going to be talking about next month in DC. I wanted to introduce you to Stan Garfield. I'm sure many of you have run across him in the past. He's an author, but he's also the founder of the SIKM community. It's a global community of over 1,000 plus KMers, and that's what I call them, people in KMers. And I've given you a link to more information. But Stan has been a speaker at KMWorld for many years, and he's definitely a KM authority. He writes a lot, and I wanted to give you a few links to some of his posts around KM issues, things that continue to be of interest to KMers, some of his thoughts about trends in the future. And so you can follow up a little bit more there on Stan's writing. And he continues to write a lot. There are many reoccurring topics at our KMWorld conference and event. And one of those is certainly, how do we get top management on board? How do we convince people that KM is important? And it's really tough if the top is not on board, but there are ways, and there are some KM groups that have, started small and ended up with a very powerful organization within their enterprise. People, how do we get people to change? How many of you have tried to change people's behavior? It's a challenge. So change management and all the tools and techniques around that is always important at KMWorld. How do we get people to share? Always something that is, again, another challenge. How do we get people to share that knowledge that's in their head? How do we get them to help others learn those skills and that knowledge? How do we put it within the organization so people can find it as they need it? It's in the flow of what they do in their activity. And how do we choose that right technology to support our KM strategy? Of course, that strategy has to be aligned with that of the organization, of the enterprise. But technology, again, is always a challenge and ever evolving and improving. And of course, this, again, as I say, is my favorite part, is what are other organizations in my industry doing? And this is where the whole networking is so important. We haven't had a live KMWorld event in 3 years. So we're really looking forward to the people interaction, the sparking of ideas and exchange of information and knowledge at the conference. And one of the ways that we do that is with a knowledge cafe. This is a concept created by David Gertine, who you may have run across. But at KMWorld, we have a morning dedicated to a knowledge cafe where we have tables of about 8 or 10 people that are facilitated by a mentor or an experienced KMer. And it's on a particular topic. So attendees at the conference can stop during the morning at 3 different tables to have conversations facilitated by the mentor, but with their peers. So they often meet people from other organizations and share their stories and challenges. And that is a very popular event at KMWorld. And certainly people meet each other at a lot of our receptions, at the sessions, at networking events like our communities of interest, which again, Stan Garfield is instrumental in pushing forward as well. So I think hopefully I've given you some ideas of the core themes and things that we talk about at KMWorld. And now if you have some questions, comments, I hope we can have some discussion. Thank you.